Chapter 6. Felix Rodriguez, the granddaddy of corrections in New Mexico, began his career as a guard at the penitentiary, as did many of his friends. There was a group of officers there who'd grown up together. These guys came home from the Korean War, and the major industry in Santa Fe was the Department of Corrections. A group of them got in there in 1953, 1954, and stayed there. Felix was the father, the paternal benevolent dictator of the penitentiary. Tony Anaya, the attorney general, who succeeded in having Rodriguez removed from his position as warden, told a reporter after the riot, "As is the custom of New Mexico's eternally Democrat-run government and his bag of political party favors, Rodriguez was not thrown out of the Department of Corrections altogether. In spite of evidence that he headed an administration heavily involved in drug trafficking and prisoner intimidation, he was given another position in the department, albeit outside the prison. As testament to his power at the time of the 1980 riot, 5 years after he was ousted, Felix Rodriguez was Deputy Secretary of Corrections, the man who ran the whole show. By then, he and his cronies were known as the Santa Fe 11, the clique that had for 20 years controlled the penitentiary of New Mexico as if it were their own private empire. I'd watched this clique strengthen since I came to prison in 1962. You might say we all grew tough together. By 1970, the clique had become firmly entrenched in the top 5 position inside the penitentiary, and everyone who held an important management post was an active member of it. The only people who kept their jobs were those who played the clique's game, the clique's way. The majority of prison personnel, including all top 5 members, were Chicano. Nepotism, that familiar abuse of power, kept it that way. Anyone with a plum position was related to a friend of someone high up in the administration. To wit, in 1971, Warden Rodriguez's administrative assistants married a personnel technician at the institution. Not only could they talk to each other about work over supper, at family gatherings they could discuss it with the administrative assistant's brother, who was the business manager, as well with the brother's nephew, the prison storekeeper. If by chance a man who wasn't well connected got hired, he'd end up with night shift in the guard tower, the worst job in the prison, until he proved he was willing to play according to the clique's rules. Felix Rodriguez, the leader of the clique, started in the prison system in 1955 and worked his way up through the ranks, from guard to lieutenant to associate warden to deputy warden. It was in this last position that he began to assume the power he'd been building throughout the years, for in Santa Fe, it was the deputy warden who actually ran the penitentiary. When Rodriguez became warden in 1970, he secured the muscle of his clique by promoting tried and trusted cronies to the 4 deputy and associate warden positions. In spite of their bitter feelings about this clique, the convicts respected Rodriguez himself. He was fair, his word could be trusted, and he was never one to side only with the guards. If he thought there was merit to an inmate's complaint, he'd call the officer in, listen to both stories, and be as likely to reprimand the guard as he would the inmate. Rodriguez had other aspects, however, which put him in the same category as the rest of his henchmen. He had a tendency to throw temper tantrums and to hold grudges. If he thought a convict was scheming to deal drugs or stash weapons, or if he caught him at it, or even if he thought he didn't like the con's attitude, he'd keep him on his blacklist forever. No matter how good the inmate's record might become, he wouldn't be able to get a job, a cell block change, or enroll in the educational programs. And Rodriguez always knew who was doing what. The snitch system was his baby, and he kept it running smoothly with promises of privileges and threats of none. He soft-pedaled the phenomenon to the press. You have to establish your network so that you're informed about everything that is happening. Most prisoners want to do their time in the easiest way possible and don't want trouble. Some of the intelligence or information that comes from prisoners is a result of that desire for quiet. Quiet my butt. The only quiet an informant got was relief from the flack the administration would give him if he didn't snitch. Rodriguez and his clique were as avid in maintaining their power and their snitch circuits as they were their philosophy that punishment was the way to rehabilitate the criminal mind. Only for 10 months in its long history did the Penitentiary of New Mexico have its helm an inmate-oriented warden, and the shortness of his term speaks for the difficulty he had in establishing his humane policies. Rodriguez had been acting warden for the year it took to find a new man to follow Harold Cox, who'd been in the top position for 7 years. When J.E. Baker came into the institution in 1968, Rodriguez went back to being deputy warden. This time, however, he had trouble wielding his unusual power. Warden Baker had ideas of his own, as well as the strength to impose them on his unwilling staff. The most radical change he made was the abolition of the maximum detention unit as a disciplinary vehicle. Though Rodriguez and his group argued that punishment was an integral part of keeping the inmates under control, Baker stuck to his plan and closed down the hole. This made a lot of the officers unhappy, but the convicts began to see that not all representatives of law enforcement were pigs. That is not to say they didn't take undue advantage of the new liberality and give the guards a bad time. Often they did, for revenge is sweet. They knew nothing serious was going to happen anymore if they were written up for an infraction of the rules, that the threats the officers made were hollow, for they had no means of carrying them out. If an inmate felt a guard was treating him unfairly, he knew he could go over his head straight to Warden Baker and find a sympathetic ear. This gave the convicts leeway to bait the guards, to speak their minds more freely. Consequently, during this period, there was a large turnover in prison personnel. These guards had not been trained even for a job as a jailer, no less for one in which they had to use psychology and man-to-man humanity in the treatment of their prisoners. Baker didn't just take away punishment, he instituted educational programs geared to teach an inmate something besides making license plates, programs that would help ease an ex-felon's re-entry into society by providing him with marketable abilities. He brought college education into prison, making it available to all convicts, not just those few the administration deemed ready to travel outside the institution to attend classes at College of Santa Fe. He initiated Project Newgate, a program that tutored inmates who wanted to get into the college classes but needed more study to meet the scholastic requirements for entrance. Rodriguez and his clique had the last word, however. Baker took over as warden just after the 1968 legislative session ended. It would be 10 months before they would meet again to take up the business of confirming his appointment. In that interim, the press and legislators heard about the liberal changes Baker had been making. Knowing their constituency didn't like politicians who were soft on crime, the legislature told Baker he was going too fast too soon. The state couldn't afford the money he was asking them to spend on corrections, and therefore they could not agree to keep him on as warden. They gave the job to Felix Rodriguez. The inmates' frustration over the reinstitution of the punishment philosophy of Rodriguez and his clique boiled over in 1970. In spite of the fact that a grand jury report in July of that year suggested that the vocational training facilities should be made available to more inmates, the clique continued to use these programs as rewards for good behavior, which meant the willingness to supply information. And in spite of the fact that the same grand jury report urged the hiring of full-time resident psychiatrists who is particularly trained in the areas of criminal psychology, narcotics counseling, and alcoholism, none were sought, no less hired. The convicts therefore had no help and much hindrance in adjusting to the switch from being treated like humans to being handled like animals. When the riot at Attica came down in September 1971, they were inspired to raise their own voices in protest, and a month later staged a work strike that wasn't altogether peaceful. Several dormitories were torn apart before the protest was quelled by police and tear gas. To Rodriguez's credit, he did later interview many of the strikers to hear their complaints about conditions. He was a good enough politician to act on what he heard. In the interest of keeping peace in the prison and the public's eye off his domain, Rodriguez opened up the educational and vocational training to more than just his snitches. Cons also had incentives for maintaining the status quo, especially those who had jobs and were prepared. Cons also had incentives for maintaining the status quo, especially those who had jobs and were participating in classes along with those who ran the drug dealing rackets. They didn't want any waves made either, and were instrumental in keeping the They didn't want any waves made either, and were instrumental in keeping the rest of the population quiet during the coming years. Dealing drugs in prison during those days was easy. I had a nice money-making hustle going on, getting marijuana smuggled in and selling it $1 a joint. As long as I didn't get in the man's way, I knew my operation was safe. For 4 more years, this went on while Rodriguez and his tight little clique ruled the penitentiary. Then in 1975, just a year after the election of a new progressive governor and an ambitious attorney general, their power preserve was Then in 1975, just a year after Then in 1975, just a year after the election of the new progressive governor and ambitious attorney Then, in 1975, just a year after the election of a new progressive governor and an ambitious attorney general, their power preserve was ruptured. Attorney General Tony Anaya had been elected to that office on the heels of a man who had brought more than a taint of corruption to it, and he was determined to restore integrity to the position. When allegations of loan sharking, drug trafficking, and bookmaking were made against the prison hospital administrator, Frank Stockman, Anaya launched a full investigation into the matter. Observers in the media considered this move a purely political one because Stockham had just been recommended for promotion by his friend of many years, the new governor, Jerry Apodaca. The complaint against Stockham, who was not one of the clique, had been lodged by Rodriguez's top men in response to the governor's recommendation. The Attorney General's investigation showed, however, that Rodriguez's men had done a bit more than simply file the complaint. They had in fact framed it through the use of their snitches. The report told the public what we on the inside had always known, that there had indeed been a clique that has run the penitentiary for a number of years. As much as the inmates use one another, they are also being used by some prison officials. There was, however, no evidence to support the criminal charges leveled against the hospital administrator. Though Stockham admitted that he'd taken drugs from the hospital for his personal use and that his loose control had made it possible for the inmates to have easy access to drugs, only this allegation was proven. It appears Stockham was attempting to assist an inmate secure money from his mother in order to pay gambling debts to other inmates. There was fear for the inmate's safety from the threat of his fellow inmates to whom he owed money. Despite his humanitarian motives, this action violates penitentiary rules. Because of this violation, the Rodriguez clique had its way and Stockholm was fired. This didn't take the heat off of them, however. The report went on to say, "It is the conclusion of the Attorney General's office that each senior corrections and penitentiary administrative official is responsible to some degree for the hasty and unprofessional manner in which the Stockholm report was put together and for acting on a report which was of highly questionable reliability. The warden and deputy warden should be each held responsible for failing to conduct a more thorough and professional investigation and for the use of hopes and promises or the veiled promises of early parole board, changes in working conditions, or changes in living conditions in the penitentiary to secure false statements." The report detailed the investigation the administration had conducted to make their charges of drug trafficking and more against Stockholm, saying it consisted of information from 5 convicts and 1 prison employee. 4 of the 5 received preferential treatment, such as being moved to trustee status or better work detail. All of them testified that they knew they would be rewarded for statements made against Stockholm and punished if they did not give derogatory statements. The Attorney General concluded the report by noting that though drug trafficking was not found in Frank Stockholm's case, there was unchecked entry of heroin, cocaine, cash, and liquor into the prison, and that the Stockholm affair has highlighted the manner in which corrections and penitentiary officials can manipulate employees and inmates to serve their own selfish interests. As a result, the corrections secretary was fired. Warden Rodriguez, along with a deputy warden, the chief security officer, and an associate warden were removed from their jobs inside the penitentiary. These 4, however, were transferred to other positions within the State Department of Corrections, where they all remained in top management well beyond the 1980 riot. With the ousting of the main members of the clique, the inmates had high hopes that the new governor, the first Chicano to be elected to the state's highest office in 54 years, was going to change the quality of prison life. Those hopes soared when his newly appointed corrections secretary hired as his administrative aide a hardcore ex-con, a man who'd spent 12 years in the penitentiary, 2 of them on death row on a first-degree murder conviction that had been commuted to life when the state's death penalty was found unconstitutional. He was the only inmate I've seen in all my years in the pen who'd used his time not only to educate himself, but to totally transform his way of thinking. Unfortunately, the hiring of this ex-con was the only progressive prison event in Governor Apodaca's term. It hadn't been a bed of roses under the Rodriguez clan, but what was to come made it look like it had been. The new warden was not the great white hope everyone expected. Ralph Aaron, an ex-federal warden with 30 years in corrections under his belt, came in with the hardline attitude that the institution had gone to hell and was going to take control because the inmates were running the place. Unlike Rodriguez, who would at least give a con a fair hearing, Aaron treated the inmates as if they were lucky to be breathing. As sparsely as Rodriguez had doled out educational projects during his reign, under Warden Aaron, they were practically nil. All programs that took an inmate outside the prison were closed down. Project Newgate folded because no one had bothered to seek funding for it. Gone now were the incentives, even the illegal ones, that kept the inmates in line for the past 4 years. The Attorney General's report on the Rodriguez clique had brought the state police in to check the drug flow into the prison. This cut down on the rackets, though it didn't entirely eradicate them. They had, after all, been flourishing during the old regime, and many of the prison personnel had been involved in them were still working in the institution. Not only were the guards aware, for example, of the narcotics trafficking, Attorney General Tony Anaya told a reporter, but some of the guards and some of the higher-ups had to be actually participating in the actual trafficking itself. It simply could not go on to the extent what it was going on without the actual involvement by officials. Though Warden Aaron's clampdown and tight security measures made it difficult to get drugs and to make a comfortable prison living from their cell, his attempts to clean up the penitentiary were frustrated at every turn. Answering a question by a news person as to whether he found that guards had been bringing in drugs into the prison during his administration, Aaron said, "Yes, we found there were several. We had a problem. We talked with the officials downtown about it. I was told at a later date, not too long before I resigned, don't worry about it, particularly if the guy was Chicano. You're not going to get him convicted." It was this attitude, together with the fact that his strict ideas about security procedures were not being carried out. Years later, he told of watching an officer leave a meeting about security regulations, walk down the corridor, and casually slide open and leave open every grill he passed through. That made Aaron quit just 6 months after he started. However, he managed to handpick his successor, Clyde Malley. Clyde Malley's zeal for security was as strong as his predecessors, but he was as ineffectual in changing the laxness of the guards as Aaron had been. In fact, during the combined 17 months, the two of them held the office of warden at the penitentiary. There were 19 escapes, more than there had been in the past 10 years. The frustrated Malley attributed one of those escapes to a complete breakdown of security, established procedures, misinformation, lack of responsible leadership, and general chaos. In 30 years in corrections, I have never witnessed such a total breakdown of basic prison practices. If this carelessness was the guards' way of saying they weren't satisfied with conditions, with being underpaid and undertrained correction officers, the inmates echoed the feeling about their own conditions and found their way of expressing it. Not only did the outside educational programs remain discontinued, but in his attempt at greater security, Malley had removed all convicts from their administrative positions in the remaining programs, returning them to the idleness that was fast becoming the most abundant occupation in the institution. The convict's mind is never idle, however. Thinking is one of the few rights that can't be taken from him. During the spring of 1976, the residents at Santa Fe spent their free time scheming on ways to get the administration to change their tune. They knew the only effective means of doing that was to catch the public's attention. This meant staging some kind of uprising to protest conditions which were intolerable from every point of view. Besides Malley's oppressive regime, the institution was infested with rats and cockroaches. The toilets didn't work, and the food was, as usual, bad. Back and forth through the vents went talk about what kind of action to take. It was decided that the entire population would stage a sit-down strike while the warden had a chance to look over a list of grievances and demands they would compile and present to him. They agreed that if the administration didn't show signs of giving in on at least some points on their list, they would launch an all-out riot and tear the prison apart. The strike leaders wrote up the tabulation of gripes and remedies and passed word through the vent grapevine that they were ready to go. On the morning of Flag Day, Monday, June 14, 1976, everyone remained in their housing units and refused to go to work or meals until their complaints were answered. By noon, the administration sent word, "We're tired of your game. You either go to the mess hall tonight or we're coming in to lock you up." No compromises, no mention of our grievances. The inmates didn't budge either, and the man did as he promised, locked all cell block residents in their houses and secured the gates to the dormitory units. Those in the cell blocks couldn't do much damage, but the 500 inmates housed in the dormitories carried out their plan and tore their units apart. 4 of the prison's 5 dorms were demolished before the riot was brought under control by guards with tear gas. No one was taken hostage. No one was seriously hurt, and none of the grievances or demands was even discussed. All that was accomplished by this outbreak was more punishment. After the tear gassing, 600 inmates were taken, 20 or 30 at a time, and forced to strip naked and stand in the main corridor while lines of guards and prison personnel on either side questioned them to find out who the strike leaders were. Of course, no one talked. No convict was going to snitch in front of his fellows, and the administration had to know this. The interrogation could only have been designed for the purpose of humiliation and retribution, as was the axe-handle gauntlet that followed. As the buck-naked inmates were made to run on their way to the gym between the 2 lines of correction personnel, they were smacked on the butt, head, back, and arms by officers wielding large axe handles. Some convicts were hurt seriously enough to warrant being sent to the infirmary for stitches. Others suffered broken knees and elbows, and all suffered yet another loss of self-esteem. One of these axe handle wielders was a member of the church. He was hated by the inmates because he catered to the short eyes, those who were child molesters and sex offenders, the most despised convicts in any prison. They were in fact the only men who attended services in his chapel. He was a sight, going around to all the dormitories after this axe handle scene preaching a hell and brimstone sermon to excuse his actions. He done it for God, of course, and everyone deserved everything that was happening to them, bad conditions and all. What he and the prison administration had been trying to do, he explained, was get the devil out of you. From that time on, he became known as Axe Handle. During the 1980 riot, the cons gave him payback by burning down the chapel. Warden Malley never made an effort to talk to inmates about their complaints. His only concern was finding and punishing the strike leaders. Those he believed to be the instigators, he placed in segregation and kept them there for months, even years. According to the Attorney General's report on the incident, others were transferred out of the prison to another state to ensure the tight control the security-oriented warden needed but never achieved. He offered no incentives to lure the inmates into good behavior, no reward, only punishment. Being locked up became such a common occurrence that the convicts started to use it to their advantage. It not only tended to enhance their tough guy image, but many looked forward to a stay in cell block 3. They liked the idea of finishing out their sentences in the privacy of a cell rather than in a population where violence, rape, and overcrowding were increasing. Escapes continued. As one inmate explained it, why is someone willing to go over a fence right by a tower and risk his life, knowing that they'll shoot him if they spot him? Because he's so frustrated with this place, doesn't see a way out, can't work towards his freedom, that he decides it's better to be shot, it's better to be killed than to remain here. In 1978, after little more than a year on the job, Warden Malley quit in disgust. He had failed to grasp the fact that control wasn't the only way to deal with human beings. Maybe his 30 years in corrections had jaded him so thoroughly that he'd forgotten it was humanity he was dealing with. We only stay in control of prisons to the degree that the prison population as a whole sees our administration as fair, humane, somewhat reasonable, and something that they can't understand. When we reach the point where a large number of prisoners see our administration as something other than that, then we have the potential for anything, commented another veteran of corrections, Lloyd Patterson, 30 years with the California prison system. I think most people who work in prisons lose sight and say, hey, we are in control. We got you guys, and we've got all the gas and sticks and guns that we need to control you. You get that idea and you're in trouble. Perhaps it was the state's recognition that a more humane administering of the prison was needed that made them appoint two gentler, though less qualified men to succeed Malley. Neither the acting warden who filled the bill while a permanent man was being sought, nor the final selection had the experience to handle the job with authority. The highest position Warden Jerry Griffin had held in corrections before taking over the top post at Santa Fe was superintendent of the Roswell Center, a minimum security institution that included community contact and community release, hardly the background needed to run a maximum security penitentiary. In the year and a few months these two relatively weak administrators filled the role of warden, the prison fell into the full control of the Rodriguez clique once again. Deputy Warden Robert Montoya, who arrived at the institution under Warden Aaron in 1975, was now the leader, at least on the inside. The corrections department itself was in turmoil, having experienced as many corrections secretaries as the prison had wardens. The only firm voice in the department was that of the still powerful original kingpin, Felix Rodriguez. Many who'd worked under Rodriguez when he was warden remained at the penitentiary. Together with the deputy warden, they reinstated the power of the Santa Fe 11 and the effective insanity of the snitch circuit. By far, the most hated member of this clique was a lieutenant nicknamed Green Eyes. Snitches weren't Green Eyes' cup of brew. His priority was playing games with an inmate's mind. He would go out of his way to make trouble for a convict, call him degraded names to his face, challenge him to talk back, and throw him in the hole if he didn't. Then get the goon squad to tear gas and beat him. I've seen him harassing inmates so many times I still have nightmares about him. Once, when I was in lockup in cell block 3, there was a Chicano a few cells down who knew he was getting a visit from his family that day. Green Eyes, who was on duty, had already told him to get dressed. After waiting an hour and still not being called again, the dude yelled over to Green Eyes, "Hey, you told me an hour ago to get ready. How come?" "You better shut your mouth," Green Eyes answered. "I'm tired of hearing it. You open it again, you won't have any visiting privilege, today or any day." What could the inmate do but sit and fume in silence? When another 45 minutes went by, he lost his cool. The fact that he'd been told to get ready meant his visitor was already there waiting. "Hey, what's the delay with my visit?" he shouted again. Green Eyes got up and called to the guard in the control booth outside the tier to come inside. When he did, the two of them walked over to the convict cell, cranked open the door and pulled him out. "Okay, smartass, we're taking you where you can scream all you want. You won't have to worry about your visits for a while." When a convict is taken to the hole, he has to wait 30 days before he's eligible to have visitors again. While he screamed and pleaded, they dragged the Chicano down to the basement, stripped him naked, and shoved him into the dark maximum detention unit. All because he had the audacity to be concerned about his weekly 1 hour chance to talk to someone who actually cared about him, someone who could, for 60 minutes out of his endless, monotonous time, make him feel like a human being. One day, I was standing in line to get canteen supplies when Green Eyes pulled someone out of the line and made him go back to his unit without buying anything. That meant the con had to spend the week without cigarettes, coffee, Kool-Aid, and snacks that made the days go by with at least a modicum of pleasure. His great crime was that he had dropped something and stepped a few feet out of formation to pick it up. It's small things like this that build and make a man hate. Many grievances were filed against Green Eyes, but nothing ever came of them. He was, after all, a long-standing member of the corrections clique. The administration agreed he might be a little hard on the inmates, but they backed his action and let him continue. He was so despised that during the 1980 riot, the negotiators offered to give up 3 of their hostages if they could have Green Eyes instead. The prison's intelligence officer was another longtime member of the clique. His job was to collate, and evaluate intelligence information affecting the safe operation of the penitentiary, and he achieved that goal by relying heavily on his snitch lines. The trouble was that he believed anything he was told and never bothered to investigate before he acted on a tip and had an inmate locked up. Consequently, grudges between inmates were often settled by channeling bogus information through his intelligence officer. Informants itching for better jobs or transfer to the honor unit knew they could feed him a lie and collect their reward. As long as it was plausible, this officer would buy it. Many a convict, innocent of the charge, has been locked up in cell block 3, sometimes for as long as 6 months on another inmate's unproven word. I could never figure whether this so-called intelligence officer was stupid, lazy, or thought every convict without exception was a badass. Fortunately for him, 2 weeks before the riot, he was transferred out of the penitentiary, though to another position in the corrections department. Many of the guards, too, developed their own snitch lines, thereby earning for themselves the promotion given by the administration when an officer was deemed attentive to prisoners' needs. In reality, this was a power game that was dangerous, sometimes fatal to inmates, and never answered any needs but those of the man's clique.